A scream shatters the silence of a winter night. It echoes through the drafty corridors of Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, a sound so raw that it slices through the whistling wind and rattling shutters like a blade through silk. In a dim chamber, lit by the trembling glow of candles, a young girl lies writhing on a blood-stained bed. She is just 13 years old, her small body convulsing with pain, her breath shallow, her face pale with terror. Her name is Lady Margaret Beaufort, and as her cries fill the air, history itself waits on the other side of the door. She is no ordinary child. Within her fragile frame lies the heir to a dynasty that will one day rule England, shape Europe, and change the fate of the world. But tonight, no one in that castle hall knows if Margaret or her unborn child will survive until morning. The midwives work feverishly, their hands steady, but their eyes shadowed with fear. They whisper Latin prayers into the darkness, pleading with saints and angels to intervene. Outside the window, snow falls relentlessly, covering the frozen ground in silence. But inside the chamber, the world trembles on the edge of death and destiny. This is the story of Lady Margaret Beaufort, a girl forced into a woman's fate, a widow at 13, mother at an age when most children still clutch dolls, and the woman who, through suffering and survival, would give birth to the Tudor dynasty, a bloodline that would end centuries of war and transform England forever. But before that moment, before the scream that announced her agony to the world, Margaret's path had already been written by powers far greater than herself. To understand her story, we must step back into a world of ambition, betrayal, and relentless struggle. A world where children were pawns on the great chessboard of politics, and where survival often meant sacrificing everything. Margaret was born in the spring of 1443, the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. She entered the world under the shadow of loss and scandal. Her father, once a favored commander of the English crown, returned from failed campaigns in France, broken in body and spirit. He had been entrusted with England's fading dream of empire across the Channel, only to watch it crumble in his hands. The whispers at court were cruel. Some said he took his own life rather than face disgrace. Others hinted at poison delivered by unseen rivals. Whatever the truth, he died when Margaret was barely a year old, leaving her inheritance tainted by suspicion and her future uncertain. Her mother, the Dowager Duchess, understood the brutal realities of noble survival. A child without protection was a prize to be seized, traded, or destroyed. And so, even as Margaret was learning to walk, her future was bartered away. At 6 years old, she was betrothed to John de la Pole, heir to the powerful Duke of Suffolk. It was a contract, a piece of parchment sealing her as a political tool, nothing more. But power was fleeting in the England of the 15th century. Suffolk fell from grace, accused of betrayal for his role in surrendering lands to France. His enemies ensured his death was as brutal as his fall from influence. Dragged from his ship and executed with a rusty blade, his blood soaking the waves of the English Channel. With his death, Margaret's betrothal was dissolved, leaving her once again unmoored. The lesson was clear. Alliances meant nothing, promises were fragile, and a girl's worth was determined by the ambition of the men around her. Margaret's fate took its decisive turn when she was matched to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI. The Tudors were outsiders, Welsh upstarts whose claim to nobility came not from ancient bloodlines, but from royal favor. Their father, Owen Tudor, had scandalized the court by secretly marrying Catherine of Valois, the widowed queen of Henry V. From that union came Edmund and Jasper, men raised under suspicion, yet elevated by the king's blessing. For Margaret, barely 12 years old, the marriage was less a union than a command. The ceremony was held at her family's castle, its halls hung with tapestries and filled with the hum of political expectation. Edmund Tudor was in his 20s, a man seasoned by war and politics. Margaret was still a child, her body unready, her mind uncomprehending of what was being demanded of her. The vows were spoken, the marriage was sealed, and with it, her life was no longer her own. Within months, she was pregnant, a child herself. She carried another life inside her, her frail frame straining beneath the weight of destiny. The whispers in the castle corridors were sharp with pity and unease. Her mother knew the dangers. At 18, she had been considered young to bear a child. Margaret was scarcely half that age. The risk of death hung over her like a shadow. But fate struck another blow. In 1456, as civil war spread across England, Edmund Tudor was captured in Wales and died in captivity under circumstances still debated by historians. Whether by plague or by dagger, he was gone, leaving Margaret widowed, alone, and carrying the child who would become the last hope of the Tudor name. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother, took her into his protection, escorting her to the windswept fortress of Pembroke Castle. It was there, in the freezing heart of winter, that Margaret faced the ordeal which would define her life. The journey itself was a torment. Carried through snow and mud in a jolting litter, her body racked with pain, Margaret arrived at the castle, already weakened. Its great stone walls loomed over the cliffs of Wales, a fortress built for war, not comfort. Drafts whistled through the cracks in the stone. Fires devoured wood without warming the vast chambers, and the sea winds clawed through every opening. In those dark halls, she labored under the watchful eyes of physicians and midwives who knew too well the dangers of her youth. Her hips were narrow, her body unfinished, her child large and poorly positioned. The physician whispered grim predictions. The birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. Options were few, each one a gamble with death. As the long night dragged on, the midwives filled the air with the smoke of herbs meant to soothe and strengthen. The girl's cries rose and fell, echoing through the stone walls like the sound of a soul being torn apart. Outside the chamber, Jasper Tudor paced the corridors, knowing that the future of his family, and perhaps of England itself, rested behind that door. Hours stretched into an eternity. Margaret's strength faltered, her body breaking under the strain. Blood soaked the sheets. Her voice grew hoarse until she could no longer scream, only gasp and moan in the dim light. The midwives worked desperately, their hands slick, their faces grim, their prayers whispered with growing urgency. And then, after 18 hours of suffering that no child should ever endure, the chamber fell into silence. For one terrible moment, it seemed all had been lost. The baby lay pale and still, Margaret herself barely conscious, her pulse weak, her body broken. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then a sound pierced the silence, thin, wavering, but unmistakable, the cry of a newborn. Henry Tudor had entered the world. Margaret, broken and bloodied, heard that fragile cry. Through the haze of her exhaustion, she reached weakly toward her son, her eyes fixed on him with a desperate intensity. For a brief moment, mother and child touched before he was swept away to be cleaned and swaddled. The damage was done. The birth had left her body shattered, her ability to bear children forever destroyed. At 13, Margaret Beaufort had become both a widow and a mother. Her childhood was over, her body was scarred, but her spirit, scarred though it was, had not yet been extinguished, for in the frail arms of that girl lay the future King of England. And though she could not yet know it, her suffering would give rise to a dynasty that would change the course of history. But what became of Margaret after that night? How did a broken child mother transform into one of the most formidable political figures of her age? A woman who would outwit kings and command the throne itself from the shadows. The answer lies in the battles she would fight not with sword or shield, but with faith, intellect, and an unyielding will forged in fire. The next chapter of her story would be even darker. The years that followed Margaret's harrowing childbirth could have ended her story before it even began. Many girls who survived such ordeals were left weakened, sickly, and easily swept aside in the brutal currents of 15th century politics. But Margaret Beaufort was no ordinary girl. Though her body was left fragile, permanently unable to bear more children, her mind grew sharper, her faith deeper, and her determination unbreakable. She understood that her survival and that of her infant son depended not on chance, but on strategy. In the aftermath of Edmund Tudor's death, the responsibility for Margaret's protection fell to Jasper Tudor. He treated her with remarkable care, recognizing that his young sister-in-law was not just a grieving widow, but the guardian of his family's only heir. Within the cold stone walls of Pembroke Castle, Jasper ensured that Henry was nursed, clothed, and shielded from the dangers of a kingdom tearing itself apart. For Margaret, still only 13, her role shifted from child bride to child mother, and every decision she made carried the weight of a dynasty. But England itself was unraveling. King Henry VI, fragile in both mind and body, was sinking deeper into bouts of madness. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, fought fiercely to protect her husband's throne and the rights of their son. But their enemies gathered strength. The rival House of York pressed its claim, and the conflict that would be known as the Wars of the Roses began to consume the realm. Caught in the middle was young Henry Tudor, a boy with a claim so distant that few considered him important, at least not yet. But Margaret knew better. She believed, with a fervor that bordered on prophecy, that her son was destined for greatness. While other noble women were content to fade into the background, Margaret carved out a place for herself. She cultivated allies, built networks of trust, and anchored her life in an unshakable devotion to God. She saw her survival and her son's future not as matters of luck, but as part of a divine plan. Her faith became her shield. While others relied on armies and castles, Margaret relied on prayer, patience, and calculation. She wore the plain garb of piety, often kneeling for hours in prayer. But beneath that humble image was a mind that never stopped working. Even as a teenager, she wrote letters to powerful men, securing favors, arranging protections, and carefully reminding them that her son, though young and vulnerable, was a Tudor, and through the Beaufort line carried the blood of kings. Yet danger was everywhere. Margaret's enemies knew that eliminating Henry would snuff out any threat from the Tudor name. Jasper Tudor did everything in his power to keep him safe, but shifting tides in the Wars of the Roses forced them into constant uncertainty. At one point, Henry and his uncle were nearly captured, and only by sheer chance did they escape into exile. Margaret could only watch from afar, powerless to protect her son with her own hands, forced instead to trust in her faith and the men she aligned herself with. By the time she was barely into her 20s, Margaret had already endured what most people could not in a lifetime: marriage, widowhood, childbirth, political betrayal, and the loss of her son to exile. Yet each trial hardened her resolve. If she could not fight with the sword, she would fight with strategy. If she could not protect Henry by her side, she would build the alliances that would one day return him to England in triumph. This was the birth of the Margaret Beaufort history would come to know, a woman cloaked in piety, but wielding power with unmatched subtlety. Every marriage she entered, every vow she made, every risk she took was aimed at a single goal: placing her son on the throne of England. And though she could not yet see the path clearly, every step she took was leading toward a destiny that would shake the kingdom. The child who had nearly died in her womb would one day become King Henry VII, and the girl who had been forced into motherhood at 13 would become the architect of a dynasty. But before that triumph, Margaret would be forced to gamble everything: her fortune, her reputation, and even her life, in a kingdom where loyalty was fleeting and betrayal lurked in every shadow. As Margaret grew into adulthood, she learned that survival in England's cutthroat politics demanded more than loyalty. It demanded adaptability. She entered new marriages, each arranged with the precision of a chess move, not for love, but for power and protection. At barely 14, she was wed to Sir Henry Stafford, a man older and steadier than Edmund Tudor had been. This union gave her some measure of peace, a brief window of stability in a life defined by upheaval. But even this fragile stability could not withstand the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Battles erupted across the countryside. Noble houses shifted allegiance overnight, and the crown itself changed hands as Yorkist kings replaced Lancastrian ones. Margaret's son Henry, though far removed from the immediate line of succession, remained a symbol of hope for the beleaguered Lancastrian cause. That made him both valuable and dangerous. Margaret understood that his very existence painted a target on his back. Her strategy was simple but brilliant: survive long enough for the tides of fortune to turn. She positioned herself carefully at court, offering obedience to whichever faction held power, yet never abandoning her quiet devotion to her son's future. When King Edward IV of York solidified his reign, Margaret bowed respectfully, but her heart remained Lancastrian. She walked a tightrope, balancing loyalty with caution, ensuring she was never branded a traitor while secretly nurturing her son's claim. In 1471, disaster struck. The Lancastrian cause collapsed after the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Prince Edward, the only son of Henry VI, was slain. Queen Margaret of Anjou, once the fiery champion of her husband's dynasty, was captured. Soon after, King Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London. With their deaths, the direct Lancastrian line was extinguished. The Yorkists believed the war was over, but Margaret saw the truth that few others noticed. Her son Henry, exiled in Brittany, was now the last surviving male heir of the Lancastrian bloodline. This realization transformed Margaret's life. She was no longer merely a cautious mother protecting her child. She was now the guardian of a dynasty's last hope. Every decision she made from that moment on was driven by one singular mission: to see Henry Tudor crowned as King of England. She forged secret alliances, whispered promises into the ears of discontented nobles, and cloaked her ambition in the language of faith and destiny. To many, she seemed a pious widow, devout and obedient, but behind her folded hands was a mind working tirelessly, mapping every path that could lead her son to the throne. Her greatest weapon was patience. She knew the Yorkist hold on power was not unshakable. King Edward might seem secure, but ambition and betrayal were constants in the kingdom's game of thrones. And when Edward's death in 1483 threw England once again into chaos, Margaret recognized the opening she had waited for. Her son's claim was distant, his army non existent, and his resources pitiful compared to the might of the Yorkists. But Margaret had something stronger than armies. She had belief. She convinced powerful nobles that Henry Tudor, a boy once overlooked and underestimated, could be the answer to England's turmoil. She offered not just a king, but a symbol of unity, a chance to heal the divisions of war. From the shadows, Margaret Beaufort had become one of the most dangerous women in England, not because she wielded a sword, but because she wielded hope. And in a kingdom weary of bloodshed, hope was a weapon sharper than steel.